Hudson Grant slammed the hood of his rusted old truck shut, wiping his grease-streaked hands on the rag hanging from his pocket. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the nearly empty parking lot of the grocery store. He was exhausted. Between working double shifts at the auto shop and taking care of his 8-year-old daughter Daisy, he barely had a moment to breathe. Just as he was about to climb into his truck, he noticed a woman standing beside a sleek black Aston Martin. The hood was up, and she was staring at the engine like it had personally offended her. "Need a hand?" Hudson called out, walking over. The woman looked up, her deep brown eyes locking onto his. She was stunning, long dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She had the kind of effortless elegance that didn't belong in a parking lot at dusk. "I think my car battery died," she admitted with a sigh. "I was in a rush, left my lights on." Hudson glanced at the vehicle. "Yeah, hey, that'll do it." He pulled his toolbox from the bed of his truck. "You're lucky I carry tools with me. Let me take a look." The woman hesitated. "I can call a service." "Don't waste your money," he interrupted. "It's just a battery. Give me 10 minutes." She watched as he worked, his hands moving with practiced ease. He removed the dead battery and replaced it with a spare he had in his truck. Hudson didn't think much of it. He'd done this 1,000 times before. "There," he said, wiping his hands again. "Try it now." The woman slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. She stepped out, beaming. "You're a lifesaver." She reached into her designer handbag, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, for your trouble." Hudson shook his head. "I don't take money for helping someone." Her brows lifted in surprise. "Are you sure?" He nodded, just glad to help. The woman studied him for a moment like she was seeing something unfamiliar. "Well, thank you." "Hudson," he supplied. "Harlow," she said, extending her hand. "Harlow Greene." Hudson shook her hand briefly, then stepped back. "Drive safe, Harlow." She hesitated before getting into her car. As she pulled away, she glanced at him through the rearview mirror, something unreadable in her expression. Hudson didn't think much of it. He had more important things to worry about, like getting home in time to make dinner for Daisy. What he didn't know was that he just helped a billionaire. And that one small act of kindness was about to change his life forever. 2 days later, Hudson was elbow-deep in an engine at the auto shop when his boss, Jerry, called his name from the front office. "You've got a visitor," Jerry said, leaning against the doorway with a bemused expression. "And I think you'll want to clean up before you head out there." Hudson wiped his hands on a rag and frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Customers usually didn't come looking for specific mechanics unless they had a complaint, and he couldn't remember messing up any recent jobs. He made his way toward the front of the shop, pushing open the glass door. Harlow Greene stood by the counter, looking completely out of place in her tailored navy blazer and sleek heels. The scent of something expensive lingered in the air around her, a stark contrast to the sharp tang of motor oil and rubber that filled the shop. Hudson paused, surprised to see her. "Harlow." She turned, her expression shifting from polite patience to something almost relieved. "Hudson, good, I was hoping you'd be here." He wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly feeling the grime on his skin. "Everything okay with your car?" "Yes, it's been running perfectly thanks to you." Her gaze flicked around the shop, taking in the cluttered tools and the cars hoisted up on lifts. "I actually came for something else." Jerry, still lurking by the office door, raised an eyebrow at Hudson before disappearing into the back. Hudson folded his arms. "All right, what can I do for you?" Harlow hesitated, as if considering how to phrase whatever she was about to say. "I run a company, a rather large one." Hudson nodded slowly, waiting. "I have a position that just opened up. A personal driver, she continued. It's not just about driving, it's about reliability, discretion, and someone who knows his way around an engine. I thought of you. Hudson let out a short laugh. You want me to be your driver? She tilted her head, eyes sharp, assessing. I do. His first instinct was to say no. He had a steady job here, even if the pay wasn't great. And Daisy, his whole life revolved around making sure she had stability. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think. I'll pay 3 times what you're making now, Harlow interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Full benefits and a flexible schedule. Hudson stared at her. That was a lot of money. More than enough to give Daisy the things he couldn't afford now: better school supplies, new clothes instead of secondhand, maybe even a trip somewhere outside this town. Still, something about the whole thing felt strange. Why me? Harlow met his gaze head-on. Because you helped me without expecting anything in return. That kind of person is hard to find. Hudson exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Harlow. I've got responsibilities here. She nodded, as if she had expected his hesitation. Think about it. I'll leave my assistant's number with Jerry. If you decide you're interested, call. And with that, she turned and walked out, heels clicking against the floor. Hudson watched her go, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. That night, Hudson sat at the kitchen table, watching Daisy color while he mulled over the offer. 3 times his salary, benefits, a flexible schedule that might actually let him spend more time with his daughter instead of being buried under hood after hood at the shop. But working for Harlow Greene, a woman who clearly came from a world so different from his own, it felt like stepping into something he didn't belong in. Daddy, you're thinking too hard, Daisy announced, not looking up from her drawing. Hudson chuckled. Yeah. She nodded. Is it about work? He hesitated, then nodded. I got a job offer today, a big one. Daisy set down her crayon and gave him a serious look. Does it mean we can get waffles on Sundays again? Hudson's heart clenched. He used to take her to the diner every Sunday morning, but lately, things had been too tight to justify the expense. Yeah, sweetheart, he said softly. It does. Daisy grinned. Then you should do it. Hudson smiled, ruffling her hair. Maybe he should. Hudson adjusted the stiff collar of his new uniform as he stood outside Harlow's estate, feeling out of place among the towering gates and sprawling driveway. The uniform was simple, crisp black slacks and a fitted jacket, but it was a far cry from the grease-stained shirts he usually wore at the shop. The decision to take the job hadn't been easy. He had spent the weekend weighing the risks, but in the end, the promise of financial security for Daisy had tipped the scales. Now, standing in front of a mansion that looked like something out of a movie, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The front door opened before he could second-guess himself any further, and Harlow appeared, looking effortlessly poised in a tailored dress. Her eyes flicked over him, assessing. You clean up well, she remarked. Hudson shifted his weight, figured I should try to look the part. A small curve touched her lips before she gestured for him to follow. As they walked through the house, Hudson took in the opulence: marble floors, high ceilings, and artwork that probably cost more than his entire apartment complex. It was a different world, and he didn't belong in it. I'll need you on call most days, Harlow explained as they moved toward the garage. There will be business meetings, events, and sometimes personal trips. If I need you outside normal hours, my assistant will let you know. Hudson nodded, keeping his gaze forward. Understood. She stopped in front of a sleek black town car. This will be your main vehicle, but there are others depending on the occasion. Hudson ran a hand over the hood, his mechanic's instincts kicking in. The car was pristine, but he could already tell it was more machine than luxury. You'll also be responsible for keeping the vehicles in top shape, Harlow continued. I assume that won't be a problem. He glanced at her. Not unless you want me to take them to a shop and overpay for things I can do myself. That earned him a quiet laugh. I'll leave that judgment to you. The first few days passed in a blur of quiet efficiency. Hudson drove Harlow to meetings, waited outside high-end restaurants, and maneuvered through city traffic with ease. They spoke little at first. She was always on her phone, handling business with the precision of someone who had built an empire from the ground up. But then, one evening, as Hudson drove her back from a late-night corporate gala, she surprised him. Do you ever wonder how different your life would be if one thing had changed? He glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, the usual confidence in her posture slightly softened. I try not to dwell on what ifs, he admitted. Doesn't change anything. She shifted her gaze to meet his reflection. That's very practical of you. He shrugged. Practicality keeps food on the table. A pause, then, you have a daughter. Hudson stiffened slightly. He hadn't mentioned Daisy, at least not to her. How'd you figure that out? You turned down money for a car battery, she said simply. Men who can't afford to be generous don't hesitate to take what's offered. That meant you had something more important than money driving you. Hudson didn't respond right away. It unsettled him how easily she had read him. Her name's Daisy, he finally said. She's 8. Harlow nodded, as if filing the information away. She's lucky to have you. Hudson exhaled through his nose. I don't know about that. I do my best, but some days it doesn't feel like enough. For the first time since he had met her, Harlow hesitated. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. My father was a man who believed his work mattered more than anything. I spent my childhood in the backseat of town cars like this one, being driven between tutors and empty houses. Hudson frowned. That why you built all this? She gave a small, almost wistful smile. At first, yes, to prove it could, but now, I'm not sure what I was proving anymore. The conversation lingered between them as they pulled up to her estate. Hudson put the car in park, but neither of them moved immediately. Hudson, she said after a beat. Yeah. Thank you for taking the job. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Yes. As she stepped out of the car and disappeared into the mansion, Hudson exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. This was supposed to be just a job. So why did it feel like something more? Hudson had never been to an event like this before. The ballroom was a masterpiece of glass chandeliers and polished marble floors, the kind of place where people spoke in low, refined voices and never seemed to rush. He stood near the entrance, dressed in a tailored black suit that Harlow's assistant had arranged for him, his usual work boots replaced with stiff leather shoes. He felt out of place, but Harlow had insisted. You're not just my driver tonight, she had told him earlier that evening. You're my guest. He had wanted to argue, to remind her that this world wasn't his, but the way she had looked at him calm, unyielding, had silenced the words before they left his mouth. So now, here he was, trying not to gawk at the sheer wealth surrounding him. Harlow was across the room, speaking with a group of investors. She was effortless in this environment, her confidence so deeply ingrained that it was like she belonged to the marble and crystal just as much as the chandeliers above them. But even in the middle of conversation, her eyes found his. She excused herself and walked toward him, her gown sweeping elegantly as she moved. When she stopped in front of him, the air between them shifted. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else, she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Hudson exhaled, not exactly my usual crowd. Mine either, if I'm being honest. He raised an eyebrow, could have fooled me. She tilted her head, studying him. You think this is who I really am? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room at the men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns, at the practiced smiles and polite laughter. Then, he looked back at her. "No," he finally said, "I don't." Her lips parted slightly, as if his response had surprised her. Before she could reply, a man approached, his expression too polished to be entirely genuine. "Harlow, I didn't realize you were bringing a date tonight." Hudson stiffened slightly, but Harlow didn't miss a beat. "Hudson's more than just a guest. He's someone I trust." The man's smile tightened. "Trust is a rare thing in our world." Harlow's gaze didn't waver. "That's why I value it so much." The conversation was brief, but when the man walked away, Hudson turned to her. "You didn't have to say that." She met his eyes. "I meant it." The night continued with quiet moments like that, Harlow finding reasons to stand closer, Hudson catching her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something between them, something undeniable, but neither of them spoke it aloud. It wasn't until the event ended that the air between them finally broke. Hudson was driving her home, the city lights casting long shadows across the dashboard. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with unspoken things. "You didn't answer me earlier," Harlow said suddenly. Hudson glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "About what?" "About whether this is who I really am." He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't think you belong in rooms full of people who don't really see you." Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. "And where do I belong?" Hudson gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He knew what she was asking, but he wasn't sure he had the right to answer. "Harlow, just tell me, Hudson." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You belong with people who don't care about the fortune attached to your name, people who see you for more than just what you've built." The car slowed as they approached her estate, but before he could put it in park, she reached forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "And do you?" she asked. Hudson turned to her, their faces closer than they had ever been. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the vulnerability she rarely let show. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough, "I do." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was charged, the weight of everything they hadn't said pressing down on them. Then she leaned in. It wasn't just a kiss, it was something deeper. Something that had been building between them from the moment he replaced her car battery in that parking lot. When they finally pulled apart, she stayed close, her forehead resting lightly against his. "Stay," she whispered. Hudson knew what she was asking. She wasn't asking him to stay for the night, she was asking him to stay in her life. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to run. He nodded. "Yeah, I'll stay." Harlow smiled, and just like that, everything changed. Hudson had never been one to second-guess his decisions. He was a man who worked with his hands, who trusted what he could see and fix. But standing in Harlow's estate the morning after their kiss, he felt the unfamiliar weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. She had asked him to stay, and he had agreed, but what did that really mean? The world she lived in wasn't just different, it was on an entirely different axis from his own. He had spent years scraping by, making sure Daisy had what she needed, never daring to imagine more. Now, he was standing in a sun-drenched kitchen with countertops that gleamed like they had never been touched, and a woman who had built an empire looking at him like he belonged there. Harlow moved about the space with ease, pouring 2 cups of coffee as if this were routine, as if it were completely normal for her to have him here. She handed him a mug, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment before she leaned against the counter. "You look like a man trying to figure out if he just made a mistake," she observed. Hudson took a slow sip of his coffee, considering his words. "Not a mistake, just new." Her expression softened. "I know, it feels new for me too." He glanced around, taking in the quiet luxury of her home. "This isn't my world, Harlow." "I'm not asking you to change," she said simply. "I don't want you to." Hudson studied her, searching for any trace of hesitation, but there was none. She meant it. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, and the moment he saw Daisy's school's number on the screen, his chest tightened. Without a second thought, he answered. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. Daisy had gotten into an argument with another student, nothing serious, but they wanted to speak with him. "I need to go," he said immediately, already moving toward the door. Harlow didn't ask questions, she simply grabbed her keys. "I'll drive." He hesitated for half a second before nodding. The drive to the school was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Harlow didn't press him with unnecessary questions. She simply navigated the city streets with the same confidence she carried in every other part of her life. When they arrived, the school's front office was a blur of neutral-colored walls and administrative chatter. Hudson spotted Daisy sitting in a chair outside the principal's office, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of frustration and guilt. The moment she saw him, her lower lip wobbled just slightly. "Hey, sweetheart," he said as he crouched in front of her. "You okay?" She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. The principal stepped out, offering a polite but firm smile. "Mr. Grant, thank you for coming. Daisy had a disagreement with another student during recess. It didn't escalate physically, but we encourage resolution through conversation." Hudson exhaled, glancing at his daughter. "What happened?" Daisy hesitated before mumbling. "He said, was making up stories about my dad knowing important people." Hudson frowned. "What do you mean?" She finally looked up at him, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Told him you work for someone really rich, and he said people like us don't know people like that. That I was lying." Hudson's throat tightened. Before he could respond, Harlow stepped forward, her presence shifting the air in the room. "Daisy wasn't lying," she said, her voice composed but firm. "Her father works for me, and more importantly, he's someone I trust. That makes him more important than any paycheck." The principal blinked, clearly recognizing Harlow's name. Daisy's eyes widened slightly as she looked between them. "Really?" Hudson reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Really?" The tension in her small shoulders eased. After a brief conversation with the principal, they were free to go. As they walked back to the car, Daisy looked up at Harlow with curiosity. "You're really that rich?" Harlow chuckled. "So they tell me." Daisy considered this for a moment, then nodded. "That's cool, guess." Hudson laughed under his breath, shaking his head. When they reached the car, Daisy climbed into the back seat and Hudson turned to Harlow. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, did," she countered. "She needed to know she wasn't wrong to believe in you." Something in Hudson's chest tightened, and he realized in that moment he wasn't just staying for himself. He was staying because, for the first time, he wasn't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be. Hudson had spent most of his life keeping people at arm's length, but Harlow Greene had slipped past every wall he had ever built. It wasn't just the way she carried herself with quiet authority or how she always seemed to anticipate the needs of those around her. It was the way she saw him, truly saw him, and didn't try to change him. But even as they settled into this new rhythm, he knew there was still a gap between them, one built from years of living in separate worlds. That gap became glaringly obvious a week later, when he picked Harlow up from a high-profile investor meeting. She slid into the passenger seat instead of the back, something she had started doing more often. But tonight, her usual collected expression wavered just enough for him to notice. "What happened?" he asked as he pulled away from the building. One of my board members implied that my personal life is becoming a distraction, she said, tilting her head against the seat. Apparently, my choice in company is raising eyebrows. Hudson's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Because of me. They didn't say it outright, but it was clear enough. A heavy silence stretched between them. I don't want to be a problem for you, Hudson said eventually. Harlow turned to face him fully. You're not a problem, they are. He exhaled slowly, keeping his focus on the road. People like that they don't see me as someone who belongs in your world. They don't get to decide that, she countered. He glanced at her, taking in the steadiness in her eyes. I'm not sure it's that simple. It is for me. Hudson wasn't used to people fighting for him. He had spent years doing the fighting himself, making sure Daisy had what she needed, making sure he didn't fall apart under the weight of responsibility. But Harlow wasn't just standing beside him, she was standing in front of him, shielding him from the judgment of a world that had never made space for men like him. And that meant something. More than he could put into words. By the time they reached her estate, the tension had shifted into something quieter, something unspoken. Harlow stepped out of the car, but instead of heading inside, she turned back to face him. Come in. Hudson hesitated, but then he followed. Inside, the house was quiet, the usual hum of distant staff and phone calls absent. Harlow set her bag down, then turned to him. Hudson. He met her gaze, waiting. I don't care about their opinions, she said, her voice softer now, but no less certain. I care about you. The air between them thickened. I don't want to be the reason you lose something you built, he admitted. You're not. He studied her, searching for any trace of uncertainty, but there was none. And that was all it took. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his hands finding her waist, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was as much a promise as it was a release. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. Stay. This time, there was no hesitation. Yeah, he murmured, I'll stay. Months passed, and their worlds began to merge in ways Hudson hadn't imagined possible. Harlow stood by his side at Daisy's school events, cheering just as loudly as he did. Hudson attended business functions with her, his presence no longer questioned, but accepted. It wasn't always easy. There were still whispers, still disapproving glances from those who thought money dictated worth, but Harlow never wavered, and neither did he. One evening, after putting Daisy to bed, Hudson found Harlow standing on the balcony, looking out over the city skyline. He stepped up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. Penny for your thoughts. She smiled, leaning into him, just thinking about how much has changed. He pressed a kiss to her temple. For the better, I hope. For the best, she corrected. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but full. Then, before he could overthink it, Hudson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Harlow turned, her eyes widening slightly as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. I know this isn't the kind of proposal you probably imagined, he said, his voice steady but raw. But I don't want to spend another day wondering if I waited too long to ask. Her breath hitched. Hudson took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Marry me. A slow smile spread across her lips, and in that moment, he knew her answer before she even spoke. Yes. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than anything else in the world. He slid the ring onto her finger, and when she kissed him, it wasn't just a kiss, it was the beginning of forever. Their wedding was as much a celebration of their journey as it was of their love. Daisy walked ahead of them, tossing flower petals with an enthusiasm that made the guests laugh. Harlow, radiant in a gown that seemed made for her, held Hudson's hand as they stood before the officiant. There were no doubts, no fears. Just them. And when Hudson kissed his wife for the first time, he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he had found the one place he truly belonged.